A man was chained in irons, forced to fight for an empire that didn't even see him as human. And yet that same man, trained his whole life to obey, one day stood up and said, "No." Not centuries later, during the American Revolution, not in the American Civil War, but more than 2,000 years ago, when a slave dared to challenge the strongest superpower on earth, the Roman Empire. This isn't just an ancient story. It's a question every era has to face. How far are people willing to go just to live free? Today, you're going to hear the story Rome never wanted to tell. The story of the slave who shook an empire. Spartacus. When Americans hear the word superpower, we usually picture something familiar. A nation with an elite military, overwhelming economic strength, and the ability to shape the global order. But before the United States, even before the Declaration of Independence, there was another superpower that dominated the known world, the Roman Empire. And this slave revolt would go on to become one of the most shocking chapters in the entire history of the Roman Empire. Rome had one of the most fearsome professional armies of the ancient world. It controlled trade routes across the seas, imposed its laws on distant lands, and proudly, almost coldly, called the Mediterranean by a single name, Mare Nostrum, our sea, an empire no one dared to challenge, a system that seemed unshakable. But there was one truth Roman emperors always tried to look away from. All that glory was built on a rotten foundation: slavery. In America, when we think of slavery, we usually picture plantations. In Rome, slaves were everywhere. They plowed the fields, built the houses, taught children, healed the sick, worked as craftsmen, and were thrown into the arena to entertain the crowds. They were the engine that kept the entire empire running. And as many historians have said, Rome was built on chained backs. But here's the question that still sends a chill down your spine. If your prosperity, your safety, even your version of a Roman dream depends on millions of people in chains, how long can that empire really stand? Rome never seriously asked itself that question. And that's exactly why Spartacus was never just an escaped slave. He became the nightmare a superpower could no longer ignore. Before he became a symbol of freedom, Spartacus wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a rebel. He was just a Thracian soldier, born in the mountains north of Greece, a tough, battle-hardened fighter who once served in the Roman army itself. That detail matters because it made Spartacus different from almost every other slave. He understood how Romans thought. He knew how their legions fought. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, how they organized, enforced discipline, and how deep their arrogance ran through the ranks. Spartacus had once been a cog inside that machine. Then one day, Rome gave him an order no man with any honor could accept: to march against his own people. That was the moment Spartacus was truly forged, the moral line he simply could not cross. It was like asking an American soldier to bomb his own hometown. An order that, the moment you hear it, makes everything you believe in collapse. Spartacus refused, and he paid for it. He was arrested, chained, branded a traitor, and sold off like merchandise. From a soldier of the empire, he became a piece of property, a slave. He was sent to Capua, home to one of the most notorious gladiator schools in all of Rome. The school was run by Gladiator, a man who was half businessman, half showbiz mogul, specializing in turning human beings into live content, blood-soaked entertainment to sell tickets in the arena. That was where Spartacus's life took a completely different turn. From the first day he walked into Gladiator's training yard, everyone could tell he wasn't like the others. He didn't just fight with muscle. He fought with the instincts of a veteran who had once stood inside a Roman battle line. The other gladiators started to look to him for support. The trainers were forced to respect him. Even the overseers began to grow wary. Because Spartacus wasn't just strong, he had the presence of a leader, the kind of man other slaves would naturally trust and be willing to follow. And in the middle of all that, the smell of blood, the beatings, the daily brutality of the gladiator school at Capua, one thought slowly crystallized inside him. He wasn't born just to serve. He was born to break the rules this empire had written over his life. In the thick darkness of the summer of 73 BC, inside the cold stone walls of the Gladiator school at Capua, Spartacus and his three closest friends, Oenomaus, Castus, and Gannicus, quietly stepped up to the edge of a choice they knew could mean freedom or death. Their plan was so insane that if any Roman had heard it, he probably would have laughed out loud. Escape using nothing but kitchen knives, wooden clubs, and a few stolen tools. No armor, no clever battle formations, just a handful of men who refused to live one more day as slaves. But history has a way of rewarding desperation. The more dangerous, the more hopeless something looks, the easier it is for it to ignite. The uprising was exposed before it even began. The guards were alerted. The whole plan was on the verge of collapsing. And yet, instead of scattering in fear, around 70 gladiators hurled themselves into the night, as if the death waiting ahead was still better than one more sunrise in chains. Because sometimes history isn't written by perfect plans, but by people who simply refuse to back down. The guards never expected that a bunch of unarmed slaves would fight like real warriors. Kitchen knives flashed through torchlight, clubs slammed into iron armor, and raw desperation exploded into a kind of strength the Romans had never learned how to measure. The armory fell. In that moment, 70 slaves suddenly became 70 fully armed fighters. Capua was breached. The survivors fled straight for Mount Vesuvius, a natural fortress with sheer rocky cliffs, a place that looked like a dead end to the weak, but like an opportunity to anyone desperate and smart enough to see it. And up there on that mountain, the thing Rome feared most began to unfold. News of the escape spread like wildfire through the fields of Campania. Slaves from all over the region heard the name Spartacus and started running, away from their masters and toward the mountain like they were running toward a promise. From 70, they became a few hundred, then a few thousand, then so many that even the Romans couldn't keep count. That was the moment fear snapped, when people who had only ever known how to run away suddenly started running toward the fight. And from the heights of Mount Vesuvius, a tiny flame of resistance was lit, a flame that would soon grow into the storm that made the Roman Empire tremble. In Rome, news of the uprising was first treated like a minor incident, no different from a handful of farmhands running away from an estate. No one in the Senate believed that a bunch of runaway slaves hiding on a mountain could possibly become anything serious. So they sent a man who was almost not even worth mentioning. Gaius Claudius Glaber, a young aristocrat with barely any real combat experience, and more importantly, someone who believed completely in the sacred Roman line. They're just slaves. Glaber was given 3,000 troops, but those 3,000 were far from elite. Many were raw recruits, some basically civilian volunteers, armed in a hurry and led by a commander drunk on his own arrogance. Glaber's plan was simple. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to encircle Spartacus, block every path down the mountain, starve the slaves out, and wait until they crawled to him begging for mercy. An easy victory. A safe little war story to launch his political career. But Spartacus was not the kind of man who sat around waiting to die. While the Roman camp settled in at the base of the mountain, Spartacus noticed a nearly impossible route down the far side, a path the Romans never even considered, because they couldn't imagine slaves being crazy enough to use it. And then, on a moonless night, the gladiators climbed down that cliff on rough homemade ropes, slipping through the darkness like ghosts on a rock face. By the time Glaber still thought he was the hunter, he had already become the prey. Spartacus struck from behind, driving straight into the heart of the Roman camp. The green troops panicked, formations crumbled, before they even understood what was happening. Glaber, the man who had been so sure he was containing the slaves, was crushed and forced to flee the battlefield. And that was just the beginning. The furious Senate sent another commander, Licinius. He also thought he was going to teach those slaves a lesson. But Spartacus ambushed his camp at night, hitting them right when Cassinius was in the bath. Once again, a Roman force was wiped out. General Verinius didn't fare any better. He marched his men into a narrow forest road, turning them into the perfect targets for yet another ambush. Result, his army was shattered, and Verinius had to run for his life. There was a pattern Rome refused to see. They always underestimated the people they had chained. Spartacus didn't. After every victory, slaves from farms, mines, workshops snapped their chains, ran away, and joined his ranks. From a few thousand, they quickly became 10,000, then 30,000, then tens of thousands. And with every new person who arrived, the fire of rebellion burned hotter. The Italian countryside went up in flames. Roads were cut off. Trade ground to a halt. An empire that once looked untouchable was suddenly being pushed to the brink by a force made up of its own slaves. At this point, the Roman senators were forced to swallow a bitter truth. The very people they had been trampling on for years had just realized there were far more of them than there were masters. After Rome's repeated defeats, Spartacus was no longer just the leader of a minor revolt. He had become a symbol, a spark of hope for people who had been told their whole lives that they were born only to die in chains. And that spark spread like a storm. Cities like Beneventum, Nola, Nuceria, Metapontum, and Thurii fell to the rebel army one after another. Everywhere they passed, slaves snapped their shackles, ran from their masters, and followed the call of freedom. From 30,000, Spartacus' army exploded to 80,000 people, a number big enough to make any empire shiver, especially when that army is marching right through its own heartland. But in the middle of all these victories, there was one thing the Romans never understood, and something many people today often overlook. Spartacus never wanted to conquer Rome. He didn't dream of a throne, didn't dream of ruling an empire, didn't dream of becoming a new Caesar. What he wanted was to take these people out of Roman territory, lead them across the Alps, get them beyond the reach of the empire, and let them start over as human beings who no one owned anymore. For an American audience, this hits a nerve. This hero wasn't fighting for power, he was fighting for the right to live his own life. But not everyone in his army saw it that way. With every victory and every drop of Roman blood spilled, the hunger for revenge grew inside some of his followers. Some factions became obsessed with loot, treating war as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to get rich. Others wanted to burn Rome to the ground, to make the empire pay for everything it had done. At the center of that divide stood Crixus, a Gaul warrior and Spartacus's closest comrade in battle. While Spartacus wanted to march north, Crixus wanted to go south, to strike directly at the beating heart of the empire, the city of Rome. Two men standing on the same peak of rebellion, but staring down two very different roads: freedom or vengeance. The arguments dragged on, no one backed down, and inevitably tragedy followed. The slave army split in two. Spartacus took 50,000 people north, still chasing the dream of escape and freedom. Crixus stayed in the south with 30,000 warriors, determined to attack Rome's core. But Rome, humiliated one time too many, finally sent a force that was far better prepared. In the mountains of Garganus, General Gellius crushed Crixus's army in a brutal battle. 30,000 slaves fell. Crixus was killed. News of his death reached Spartacus like a knife to the heart. And that was the moment the story shifted into a deeper tragedy. The rebellion was no longer fighting only against Rome. It was now, in a way, fighting against itself. After Crixus's death, Rome finally understood this wasn't just another routine uprising. They were facing the greatest internal threat the empire had ever seen, one of the most terrifying wake-up calls in the entire history of the Roman Empire. The generals before Glaber, Cassinius, Verinius, Gellius had all failed, and with every defeat, the Senate was forced to repeat the one truth they never wanted to say out loud: none of them could beat Spartacus. So Rome reached for a name that even senators spoke with caution: Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus wasn't just one of Rome's most ambitious politicians. He was the richest man in the empire, a man who could buy, bend, or crush anyone who stood in his way. But what made Crassus truly dangerous wasn't his money. It wasn't even his influence. It was the kind of cold-blooded ruthlessness that bordered on inhuman. To take on Spartacus, he paid out of his own pocket. To raise an army of 50,000 men, drilled under a discipline so brutal that just hearing about it was enough to make young recruits tremble. And to make sure no one dared run from battle, Crassus revived a punishment so terrifying it had been mostly abandoned since the old days of the Republic. Decimation, the execution of 1 out of every 10 soldiers in a unit, if they broke and ran. A punishment so extreme that even Romans feared it. That was Crassus, and he was ready. Crassus deployed his forces south of the Alps, blocking the only route Spartacus planned to use to lead his 50,000 followers back toward their homelands. Spartacus tried to break through the line. Bloody clashes followed one after another. But against Crassus's iron discipline and ruthless tactics, he lost around 6,000 men and was forced to pull back into southern Italy. By now, Spartacus was exhausted. His slave army was worn down from constant marching, constant fighting, and constant hunger. He knew that if they kept getting pushed into a tighter and tighter corner, every last hope would eventually be crushed. So Spartacus made one final desperate gamble: escape by sea to the island of Sicily. Sicily, the grain basket of the empire, a place that had already seen multiple slave revolts in the past. If Spartacus could reach it, he might rebuild his forces, widen the war, and even drag Rome into a long, grinding civil conflict. So he struck a deal with a group of pirates, gold in exchange for ships. Spartacus and his men set up camp near Reggio Calabria, staring out at the water, waiting for the boats that would carry them out of the kill zone. But the pirates took the gold and vanished. Spartacus had been betrayed, and now he was trapped at the toe of the Italian boot, a narrow strip of land with no real way out by sea, no safe way out by land, and no escape route left on the map. Crassus moved in for the kill. He ordered the construction of a defensive line nearly 40 miles long, with walls, trenches, and fortified positions, stretching across the narrowest part of the peninsula, a massive barrier of men and steel, built for one purpose: to pen Spartacus in like a wild animal before the final hunt. On top of that, the Roman navy closed in and sealed off the coastline. Spartacus and tens of thousands of his followers were now completely isolated. No way out, no steady food supply, no reinforcements, no hope on the horizon. Hunger set in. Morale started to crack. The whole army began to slide toward despair. But Spartacus refused to die like something caged and cornered. On a pitch-black night, he led a surprise assault straight into Crassus' fortified line. Steel clashed in the darkness. The Roman camp erupted into chaos, and in the middle of that chaos, Spartacus punched a hole through the blockade and drove the survivors north. But just as he slipped from Crassus' grip, another shadow was closing in. Pompey, Rome's legendary general, and Lucullus, the governor of Macedonia, were both marching their own armies to assist Crassus. In reality, Rome had finally decided to throw the full weight of the empire at one man and his army and crush Spartacus once and for all. After breaking through the blockade and pushing north, Spartacus was down to one last hope: Brundisium, the only port that could still take him and his survivors to free territory. But when he arrived, he saw the sight that dropped his heart into the abyss. Lucullus, the Roman general from Macedonia, had already landed there first. The last door slammed shut. The sea was sealed. The mountain passes were blocked. Rome had finished closing its trap. In one final desperate attempt, Spartacus sent a letter asking Crassus to negotiate, not to surrender, but to find some way to save as many of his people as possible. Crassus answered with silence. He didn't want a deal. He wanted to end the legend. 71 BC, near the river Salars, two armies faced each other across the field. Around 50,000 former slaves, exhausted, starving, but still standing, because the only thing they still owned was freedom inside their own minds. Crassus's legions, soon to be reinforced by the armies of Pompey and Lucullus, Spartacus stepped out in front of his lines. No shield, no heavy armor, just one man standing before those who had followed him through fire and blood. He looked at them, former blacksmiths, potters, farmers, kitchen slaves, gladiators, people who had turned pure despair into an army. And Spartacus spoke without shouting, without roaring. Today, we either walk away as free men or we fall as free warriors. Rome may own our bodies, but only we decide what our last day looks like. That wasn't a speech. It was an oath, a statement from men who understood they had nothing left but their honor. And then iron slammed into iron. The ground beneath their feet turned into red mud. Wave after wave of slave fighters crashed into the Roman lines, like surf against a cliff, powerful but desperate. Every step forward cost a life. Every yard of dirt was paid for in blood. Spartacus did not fall back. He didn't hide behind anyone. He hurled himself straight into the heart of the Roman formation, aiming at one target and one target only, Crassus. On the way, he cut down 2 senior officers, ripping apart their escort like lightning tearing through a storm. He got so close that there were just a few more steps between him and the man who had driven tens of thousands into a dead end. But then, in a sea of spears and shields, Spartacus was swallowed up. They say he fought to his very last breath, so fiercely that no one could even identify his body afterward, because he fell inside a ring of dead Romans. He died the way he lived, face to face with power, refusing to bow. Aftermath: Rome wins, but the scar never heals. About 50,000 former slaves died in that battle. Rome lost around 12,000 soldiers, a staggering cost. But Crassus still wasn't finished. To send a message to anyone who might ever dream of freedom again, he ordered 6,000 survivors crucified. Along the Appian Way, the legendary road leading back to Rome, for more than 120 miles, every few dozen yards, stood another cross, a highway of crucifixes stretching all the way to the Capitol's gates. The sight was so nightmarish that historians later called it the longest road of death in Roman history. But there was one thing Crassus, Pompeius, and anyone else in Rome could never nail to a cross: the idea that human beings have a right to live free. And that is why Spartacus, even in defeat, became immortal, not just for Rome, but for the entire world. After the Battle of the Silaris, Romans walked across fields piled with bodies, but they never found Spartacus. No grave, no tombstone, no memorial. Only the story of one man who dared to stand up to the most powerful empire of his age and then vanished into history like a ghost. That very disappearance made his name even harder to bury. He isn't remembered as just another corpse on a battlefield, but as a rumor, a legend, about the slave who once made an empire tremble. Rome tried to make the world forget him. They wanted the story of Spartacus to stay buried forever, under the blood and sand of the arena. But history doesn't take orders from Rome. His name kept coming back in ancient texts, in European literature, in art, in Hollywood movies, and in every movement where human beings tried to stand up against injustice. Spartacus became a symbol, not just for Roman slaves, but for anyone who has ever been cornered in the dark and still found a way to lift their head. For Americans, this story hits even harder. The United States carries a heavy past with slavery. There were the Underground Railroad, slave uprisings, and people who literally risked everything to run toward freedom. There was a civil war, fought to answer a single question: can a nation born with a promise of liberty survive while keeping millions in chains? And when people look back at Spartacus, it's hard to avoid a bitter comparison. In the end, what truly defines a great empire? Its mighty armies, or the way it treats the weak as people inside its own system? That's the question Rome got wrong. And they paid the price, not just in blood, but in the way history remembers them, and in how the entire history of the Roman Empire is forever haunted by the name Spartacus. What Spartacus leaves us is not a military victory. On the battlefield, he lost. But on a deeper level, a level Rome could never touch, Spartacus won. In meaning, in symbolism, in the message carried by his story. He showed that freedom is not a gift handed down by those in power. Freedom is something people have to seize for themselves, with blood, with pain, with a terrible price. And that truth never gets old, even after nearly 2,000 years. In the end, the story of Spartacus is not just for Rome or for those who literally lived in chains. It's for you, the person watching this right now. You may not be shackled like a Roman slave, but ask yourself, what's chaining you today? Fear, crippling debt, a job that's draining the life out of you? A system that makes you feel too small to matter? Spartacus left humanity one question, and it hasn't gotten any lighter in 2 millennia. What are you willing to risk to be free? And that is why, almost 2,000 years later, his name is still echoing like a flame that keeps reminding us that freedom only truly exists when someone is willing to stand up and fight for it. Rome won the war, but it never managed to control how the world tells this story. As long as there are people who refuse to bow to injustice, the name Spartacus will keep being spoken, not just as a line in an old history book, but as a reminder that in every age, there are always people willing to say enough to their chains. And now it's your turn. If you had been part of Spartacus's army, would you follow him across the Alps to try and find your way home? Or would you turn back and face Rome to the very last breath? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to read what you would choose. If you love stories that turn ancient history into a mirror for the questions our world is still struggling with today, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. There are so many more stories like this, of empires that once looked untouchable, and ordinary people who dared to do the impossible, waiting for you to discover. I'll see you in the next video. And remember, freedom always begins with one person who refuses to bow.